Well, hi, folks. Welcome to episode 2 of Blue Skies, the Solway Aviation Museum podcast. And this time around, we're changing service, and I'm delighted to welcome along Jace Phillips, who trained as an observer in the Fleet Air Arm, flew initially on Sea Kings, went on to fly with the Royal Australian Navy on an exchange tour, and finished his flying career on Merlin. So varied flying career. We'll be focusing on the Sea King aspects of that, but undoubtedly we'll stray into some of the other stuff. So, Jace, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no problem. Tell us a little bit about yourself then.
I was born in Australia, came to the UK when I was one because my father was told my grandmother was terminally ill with cancer. So he took 6 months sabbatical from his job in Australia. We came back to the UK. My mum fell in love with England on the train from Southampton to London, which has always concerned me as to what is fantastic on that line to take her away from Tasmania. And as it was, my grandmother lasted another 13 years and my mum and dad never went back. So I although brought up a POM, I'm deep down a dinky-die Aussie.
Right, fantastic. How did you end up joining the Royal Navy then? I mean, as an Air Force man, I have to say, presumably you didn't do well enough at school, but there's probably more to it than that.
Well, probably straight back at you. So my dad was a Spitfire pilot in the Air Force. So that was enough to force me to join the Navy, I guess, would be my counter to that. So it was by accident, really. I had thought about it when I was at boarding school, and a careers manager or officer came round one day and he was talking about joining the Navy and bits and pieces. But back then, I think you needed to have a science O-level or something or other, and I definitely wasn't a scientist. And I put it to bed and just thought it's not going to work for me. And at the time, I hadn't really thought about being aircrew. And then when I was at university in my second year, one of my mates, his uncle was somebody very high up in British Gas. And he said, this summer I'm going to work on a gas rig in Morecambe Bay, and I'm going to earn more in 2 weeks than you'll earn in 12 for the normal summer vacation. So for once in my life, I was brave, and I said, do you want a mate to go with you? And he said, I'll ask and I'll see. So they came back and said, yeah, you can go. So we did a week survival training over in Lowestoft, and we flew out in a helicopter to the rigs in Morecambe Bay. And I remember, I'd never been in a helicopter before. 50% of me absolutely terrified, 50% of me, wow, this is the greatest thing I've ever done. And we got on the rig and there were just helicopters coming and going all day long. So I just watched the helicopters. This was 1984-ish, probably. No internet, no mobile phone, maybe 5 channels on the TV, just about. But newspapers coming all the time because of the helicopters coming. And the Sunday supplement magazines, the Navy was running an ad at the time, which was, if you can divide 13,500 by 8 3/4 whilst upside down in a 4-6 or something, you should be officer aircrew, Royal Navy. And I still to this day, I've never been able to do that calculation or whatever it was. I'd love one day to try and find that ad, because that was the inspiration for me. And then literally when we flew ashore, I rang up to speak to my girlfriend, my now wife, and I said, I know what I'm going to be. I'm going to be a pilot in the Royal Navy. And that was it.
We've got a massive archive in the museum of back issues of Flight magazine and Aviation Week and stuff. So if I ever come across it,
there might be, as I say, 1984-ish it would be, but it was in the, the Observer, the Sunday Telegraph magazine. It was those sorts of glossies that you used to get. That was the inspiration for me. And then so I thought, right, okay, I'm going to join. I went through the grading process back at Biggin Hill in those days. Right. Passed observer, failed pilot. Was desperate to be a pilot. I don't know why, really, just probably because my dad was a pilot and I knew that I'd get grief if I wasn't a pilot. Back then you had to wait a year before doing your tests again. I went back the following year, started to do the tests thinking, blimey, why am I doing this again? I'd love to be an observer. And funnily enough, they said, Phillips, observer only, not pilot. So then I came back and explained it to my father, And I said, "Oh, I'm going to be an observer in the Royal Navy." Well, I hope to be. Obviously, I didn't really appreciate the number of hurdles.
Yeah.
Perhaps when you naively start flying training, that you realise every flight's a chop ride. And he said to me, "Well, what's an observer do?" And I said, "They're like a navigator, but they do all the tactics. They do all this stuff." And he said, "Oh, right, yeah, every navigator's a failed pilot." So that was the end of sympathy, etc., from my father. And yeah, so delighted as I was to then be selected to at least start the process.
And so the training presumably took you to Dartmouth initially?
Yeah. Yes, Dartmouth initially for 2 terms. So back then there was a huge influx and requirement for aircrew. So there used to be 2 entries per term, a half-term entry as well of wannabe aircrew and air traffickers. So I did my 2 terms, had a great time, and then straight into the flying training pipeline.
So where was your first stop in flying training then?
First stop was we did the survival training down at Seafield Park in Portsmouth first, and from there came down to Coldrose. So that would have been 1990, and began training a basic observer course flying the jet stream. So basically learning navigation, basic radar techniques, those kind of things, and probably I guess trying to establish whether or not I'd be airsick or not for as a weeding process for the remainder of flying training.
So did you go straight onto Jetstream then? I asked because my nav training at Fittingly, the Domini was the first aircraft we did proper nav training on, but we got a few orientation flights beforehand in a Bulldog. Did you do anything like that?
No, we didn't. We didn't do anything. We just straight in the jet stream, get on with it.
Yeah, and for those for folks watching who've been to the museum that know we've got a Sea Prince. The Sea Prince was the forerunner of the Jetstream in Navy rearcrew training, wasn't it?
Mm. Yes, that's right.
I mean, in the Sea Prince, it's side by side seating down the side of the aircraft. Was the Jetstream set up like that, or was there? Did you have?
No, the jet stream had 2 single-seat mission consoles, one behind another.
Okay.
So theoretically, you could, for something like a transcontinental nav, something like that, you could have 2 in place and cycle between them, and then there was a seat on the other side of the aisle for the instructor or instructors to sit. So yeah, you were facing fore and aft.
And so going through training, and I'm picturing this in my own head, and I think I know the answer now. But what options were available for your first postings? Was it all Sea King at that stage? Or was
No, so they would stream you, I guess, on the basic course, and you would come out and be either, if you went Sea King, you went airborne early warning, so the Sea King with the bag on the side, or you went ASW, pinging, or you could have gone Lynx back then. So you go to Portland, as it was, and go through your training there. So you'll spend your life on small ships as opposed to potentially small ships and bigger ones.
And how did you find out? At what stage of the training did you find out where you were going, and how did they do that? Was there some sort of postings party?
No, it was nothing as glamorous as that. I think, to be honest, Mal, I never cared about it. I just wanted to get front line. That was all. I just wanted to fly. I didn't care, where it was really or anything. They did a streaming exercise when you were going through course, which was, I think, to see whether or not you had the aptitude to be airborne early warning. So they did some rudimentary sort of fighter control.
Awareness.
Yeah, it was it was, if you were good at computer games, you'd be a whip at it now, but of course they didn't really exist back then. So it was sort of a bit Atari like, can you get this to home on that? Can you get 2 contacts to go through a gate? Clearly I didn't have the coordination to be a pilot. I didn't have the coordination to do that either. So it must have been at the end of course. There might have been whispers about where there were gaps or whatever, but yeah, I just remember being told, right, Phillips, you're going pinger, which is the colloquial name for an anti-submarine warfare stream. And I was delighted. I was just delighted that I'd got through that first phase.
So for people not familiar with that Navy lingo, presume at the time were there four variants of Sea King in service: pingers, baggers, junglies, and SAR.
Yeah, after a fashion. So three variants really, and then they used all they did for SAR was they took the sonar out of the Sea King Mark 5 or Sea King Mark 6 and just used it as a utility really for SAR.
And junglies were the stripped out variants for
Yeah,
primary commando transport.
get completely stripped out. So, that they were absolutely just a truck. So two front seats and then just cattle class throughout, obviously entry and exit mainly through the side door. Whereas in the airborne early warning and the pinging variants down the back, the back seat crew sat facing forward with all the radar and tactical equipment in front of them.
And again, for folks watching who haven't maybe been following closely with the arrival of our Sea King, it's an HAS6 version like you flew, but it started out life way back in the early 80s, so it was an ASW platform back then. In the Falklands War, ours was stripped out for troop transport, so sort of faux jungly for the
Yeah,
duration.
yeah, and indeed later on we'll probably come on to it. At one point in my career, I was an instructor on a squadron flying sixes, and we were directed to go to Sierra Leone to do evacuations. So what happened was we were diverted into Jib. We picked up some jungly aircrew who came to augment us. Then we stripped out the back of the aircraft, and they taught us some overwater jungly techniques. And then we christened out, we were Pinglies was what we became. So
Oh God.
sadly, we never got to. We turned around at Dakar because by then the Americans had arrived and done everything. So we never got our chance to demonstrate our Pingley skills.
What a shame. I hadn't heard that one before. That's good.
Yeah.
But so once you'd been selected for Sea King, what changed in the training then?
So then you used to go to do advanced flying training. So you'd done basic flying training, for want of a better phrase, basic observer course. You then went to do AFT, advanced flying training, which was effectively conversion to type. So you then got used to it goes a bit slower in a Sea King than it did in a Jetstream. Lots of radar work, lots of control. So back then you controlled yourself using the radar so that you didn't hit granite. You also took other aircraft under your control. And I think back then probably you could control yourself possibly +3, which seems quite scary now as a concept. And at night or in crap weather, you could control them about the sky to do stuff. You'd also learn all the secondary roles, so winching, load lifting, all that, so that you were competent on a Sea King. And then for me, at the end of that phase, we were then awarded wings.
Where were you doing that phase of training? Was that still at Culdrose?
Everything was at Culdrose, yes. Culdrose was the home for everything.
When you were talking there about being able to control or do separation using the radar, again, some folks won't know, although the aircraft was designed around that dipping sonar, you also had a surface search radar as well, didn't you? So did that
Yeah.
have some form of air picture mode as well?
Yeah, so it was an I-band radar, so it was brilliant at showing up land, ships on the sea, and then if aircraft had particularly an I-band transponder, you could see a contact, but it would be given away because it would have a series of eyebrows on it, so you could see the aircraft then. So we could legitimately give separation from ourselves. And we would do that. What things that we practiced was, for example, if we were in the middle of nowhere in the ocean and you had to get back to the ship, but the weather wasn't very good or you were unfamiliar with the deck, you do a helicopter controlled approach. So like an instrument approach that you do at an airfield, or for those perhaps aviators in amongst the listeners, you did a surveillance radar approach, SRA or a PAR, for example, a talk down. We could provide a talk down for ourselves, and we go down the ship's red 165, so we'd arrive off the port quarter at a quarter of a mile, hopefully, and then as the pilot looked up, he'd see the horizon bar and everything else would be there. Equally, if there was another aircraft out there and it had lost its radar or whatever, you could then take them under control and endeavour to drive them down the line too.
Yeah, okay. It's good. No, we had a similar thing you could do in the Tornado called an internal aids approach, where you put a mark on the end of the runway, assuming you could find the runway, which
Yeah.
during training was probably about 50-50. And then, again, do a non-precision approach, effectively. Yeah. So what was your first posting then? Where did you go for your first?
So after getting wings, back then that wasn't going to the front line. That was you just passed advanced flying training. So equally at the same time back then, so if a busload of aviators turned up at Dartmouth on the same day, some wanting to be pilots, some wanting to be observers, the pilots used to go off to Topcliffe and Linton and be streamed there, because they might go fixed wing to go Sea Harrier back in the day, or they'd be streamed to go Lynx, Jungley or Pinger. Sorry, after Linton, I think it was, they would then come down to Coldrose and fly the Gazelle, and they would do basic flying training. We had all the Gazelles here, so all basic rotary training was done at Coldrose. Okay. Then at the end of that phase, they would get their wings and they would be streamed. And so then theoretically, if you walked through the doors of Dartmouth with a mate of yours who ended up being a pinger, you could both be together. You'd both be awarded wings at completion of advanced flying training. Then you'd go and do operational flying training. So effectively go to the OCU and you'd learn to fight the aircraft. You did 2 phases, a 2-week phase and a 3-week phase where you went away to sea. So you went on the back of a fleet auxiliary tanker or Argus, the aviation training ship, and you'd go off and you'd learn your trade of doing day and night deck landings, So once you'd finished that, then you would go to your frontliners. So it was at the end of operational flying training that then you would be pinged to go whichever squadron it was. And back in my day, there were 3 frontline ASW squadrons. So you would have gone to one of those, 2 carrier squadrons, and then there was a squadron which was made up of flights which sent Sea Kings to the back of small ships. So back then, Batch 2 and Batch 3 Type 22 frigates, and they had 2 flights going to RFAs. And this squadron was 826. I was sent there, and I thought that's brilliant, because I'd really enjoyed the 5 weeks total sea time, or whatever it was, in the fleet auxiliaries of doing my OFT, and I thought, well, that's where I want to go, because the ships are, although they're there doing vital naval support, they're very much run along the lines of, they have a union, for example, and all sorts of stuff. So I certainly remember, back then it was great because you go night flying, and then the bar would still be open, or someone would open the bar at 1 o'clock in the morning, or whatever the case may be. And so I thought, oh, that's the place for me to go. And then when we went to 826, the first 2, they were listed alphabetically. A and B flights went to Batch 322 frigates. So you mixed with the seagoing fraternity up close and personal. Fish heads, we call them in the Navy. Mm-hmm. And C and D flights were RFA flights. And I can remember there were a number of us that were going to the squadron, probably 7, 8, maybe, something like that. And he just had a list and he said, oh, Phillips and Bolton A flight, somebody B flight. And I did excuse me, sir, I think there must be some mistake. I think you'll find that I'm going to C or D flight. And he just looked at me and just said, Phillips and Bolton, A flight. And so I found myself, my first tour was on the back of a frigate. So 1,000,000 miles away from being on a huge, in comparison, fleet auxiliary, I was on the back of a frigate. And literally, no sooner had I joined, we then threw ourselves into operational sea training, where you used to go, I guess it's a bit, in RAF terms, Stanival, but Stanival for ships, and aircrew were involved very much in that as part of the flight.
Workup training for going out on a fleet deployment?
Yeah, absolutely. So
I think people know that as...
flag officer sea training. So it used to be in the Portland sea areas, it's now in Plymouth areas, but back then it was really busy. Even when you were alongside, when you think you might get a breather, the Fosties could come on board and start a fire somewhere or do this or do that. And it would be fire, flood, all sorts of carnage going on for about 4 or 5 weeks, I think, something like that. But it was brilliant because obviously it served its purpose because the ship got really worked up at doing all the bits and pieces it was going to do. You got to know everybody that was on the ship. And then I guess you put all that hard work in to start with, and then you can enjoy the deployment afterwards. And, for me, I was extremely lucky because the first deployment in Cumberland was we went to the West Indies. So my first frontline trip was 6 months in the West Indies.
And to go back to that FOST training, even though you were on the ship as aircrew, you have to contribute to firefighting, damage control, all of that.
Yeah, everything. So everyone pitches in. So I think maybe aircrew are not always brilliant at it. So there'd normally be a rush of aircrew volunteering to be casualties, and then people would come, put makeup on, and I can remember having a lolly stick and some sort of plaster up to make it look like I'd got a fracture and various bits and pieces like that. So that was, probably as a good a way of contributing and saving a capable member of the ship's company from dying by dying ourselves, I think.
So what was that first ship you joined?
Cumberland.
Cumberland.
We went to the West Indies for 6 months. So we were the West Indies guard ship. So we were there. We did so many counter-drug patrols. We were primarily doing that, which was good, and really good training. But also we were there in case, there was a hurricane, disaster relief, any of that kind of stuff. So it was great.
So counter-drug stuff, did you mount a machine gun for that, or were you purely doing the find and plot?
I guess the deployment was split in two halves. So we started off, we just did surface plot, and then we would call in the ship. And then second half of the deployment, it got a bit more, all we could do was literally on Channel 16, you could para sabago, which is Spanish for stop your boat. Or, we had a big stop sign that was about 4 foot square that we'd, hover alongside, open the door and put the sign up, but not that they would necessarily take much notice. Second half of the deployment got a more threatening, probably, in that we flew every sortie with a GPMG with 1-in-1 tracer, and then the ship also had a live depth charge, which it kept in the hangar, should that be called upon for us to use.
Yeah, right. Oh, interesting times. So did you plan for missions like that? Or did you have like a standing plan for those sort of sorties? Or did you plan each day based on today's tasking and the weather?
It would normally be just do surface search.
Yeah.
But I think for many on the ship that they had to get used to was the Sea King's radar was a 360-degree scan, and could take you out, depending on the weather conditions, to in excess of 100 miles. So often the ship would say to us, right, we want you to get airborne and we want you to search out to 70 miles around the ship. And without sort of wishing to sound glib, but we'd say, well, it's a 2 hour 30 sortie. What do you want us to do for the other 2 hours 15? Because it was so capable. We did work with the US Coast Guard because back then we couldn't board. So we had to have a US Coast Guard Ledette team, and they would do the boardings because they were the only ones that back in the legal framework that existed then could do the boardings. But we did get some stuff that was intel led, so that made life a bit more exciting when you were told there was going to supposedly a vessel in position roughly within 5 miles, and so you do the pre-dawn stuff and pitch up, and wow, blimey, there's one there. That's amazing. It was exciting, and particularly for your first tour. For me, I was very fortunate because normally the Sea King has 4 crew, 2 pilots, an observer and an air crewman. Because we were on a flight for whatever reason, we had 2 observers. So the other observer was a lieutenant commander. He was the flight commander, and he was very big into driving ships. So he had been a general list ship driver before dabbling in the world of aviation. So he spent most of his time on the bridge coaching the bridge team how to operate a Sea King. So that was brilliant for me because I spent all the time flying. So, he was very generous with me, and I probably did 80% of the flying and he did 20. So it was a fantastic airborne classroom for me to learn my craft.
Yeah, brilliant. And what's the division of workload then between the four of you on board, the two pilots you mentioned, the observer and the crewman?
I guess it depends. It depended what we were doing. So for the pilots, they're busy getting off the deck and depending upon the weather, but a batch 322 frigate, the flight deck, 17 feet above the sea. Taking off from that, if it's rough, can be a bit of a challenge. Landing on, even more so, particularly at night. So that would be their busy bit, depending on the nature of the sortie, really. If we were getting airborne to go and do like an anti-submarine sortie, so if we were off Portland, as we were, doing when we did operational sea training, and we were doing a combined anti-submarine exercise, then the observer would be right in it from the start. And that was the great thing, because back then you could be, a junior lieutenant in the back of an aircraft in a Thursday war where there might be one, possibly even two carriers with admirals embarked and all sorts, and you would in the fight. You'd be telling the ships where to go, do all this, do all that. It was a fantastic place to be. And it was really, when it went right, it was really exciting because you were there, you were the boss man, right, doing all this stuff. So the observer would be really busy running the radar, tactical plot, and the radios. If you were doing any form of anti-submarine work, so if it was either active, so again for the uninitiated, active is the aircraft goes into a hover. The Sea King used to hover at 40 feet above the sea, lower a big electric microphone effectively on a long bit of electric string, press the button just like the Hunt for Red October, one ping only for silly, and the ping goes out. If there's a submarine there, the sound bounces off the submarine, comes back up the electric wire, there's a contact, I can see it, and then the observer will run the tactics, ultimately leading in dropping a torpedo on the submarine or controlling another aircraft to drop a torpedo on the submarine. The other way of doing anti-submarine, the other way we can do it is passive, and we drop a load of sonobuoys, and they're like microphones in a big can of baked beans. They drop a hydrophone out the bottom, and they float at the surface, and they have a radio aerial which has a VHF uplink. They don't ping at all, they just listen. So if you lay them in a line and the submarine beautifully makes it like a capital T and drives through the middle, for example, then the buoys will detect frequencies. Everything makes a noise. Yeah. Submarine, everything has engines, motors, batteries that all make some form of noise, and this will be picked up. And so in the perfect world, that, if you like, rather than a knife fight in a phone box, that one's more like a game of chess. And if you do it right and you don't overfly the submarine, you know where he is. The first thing he'll know is when the torpedo goes in the water.
What weaponry are you lining up to use there? You've got a couple of options, did you?
So yeah, well, when I first started, we had three options. So we had torpedoes, a Stingray torpedo. We had a Mark 11 depth charge, it's like a big hand grenade. And I guess the proper word would be to say I can neither confirm or deny, but we had a bucket of sunshine.
Yeah.
So. But by the time I went front line, we just had depth charge or Stingray torpedo.
And when folks come and have a look through our Sea King, they'll come in through the cargo door, if you like, on the side. Looking at that rear console there, window seat was the observer with the radar display. Aisle seat was the crewman with the sonar equipment.
Yes, that's right, yeah.
And then up front, captain right-hand seat?
So Navy's different to the Air Force in that traditionally in the Navy it's the most senior person in the aircraft.
Okay.
So it could be the observer, would be the aircraft commander. As over the years, the regulations, etc., that we now have changed slightly. You could have a pilot might be the aircraft commander, but the observer would be the mission commander if you were going to do something tactical. So you could theoretically have two commanders in there, but one is primarily aimed at concentrating on aircraft safety, achieving the mission, and getting everybody back. Whereas the mission commander is very much focused on achieving the mission.
So from how you've described it, then it sounds to me like there wouldn't be any significant differences between planning and executing an operational sortie versus a training sortie.
No, there wouldn't be, because we had a briefing format that we would run through for everything. And I guess the only bit that would vary in that would be when you briefed the conduct, because the conduct might be, it's a standard surface search today, the weather's beautiful, we'll go and do this and then we'll come back for tea and medals. Equally, it might be there's a pre-brief threat, whatever it is, here are the photographs of it, these are the details, latest intel gives it there, I've DR'd all those kind of tactical elements, so it would vary. But I guess the format was the same. There would probably just be a little bit more detail depending upon the tacticalness of what you were going to do.
Yeah. Certainly for us on the Tornado, we would try and cram 2 or 3 targets into a sortie in training, but in on operations, you either you went off without a target and were given it airborne, or you would just have the one target, and the idea was you drop all your weapons on the one.
And I guess the similarity with us, Mal, I suppose, is that every time we got airborne, we could find ourselves doing search and rescue, which would always be the unknown when you're out there, because so long as you had a properly constituted and competent crew, that's it, that's what you're doing. And when we were on the flight, well, indeed, any time that we were at sea, we would always maintain a SAR capability. And when we were embarked on the frigate, we were SAR every night. And indeed, I was on my first tour. I hadn't at that stage even achieved my certificate of competence. So whilst we get our wings, and you might think, oh, hallelujah, I've made it. In terms of the hurdles, you then had to pass operational flying training. You then got to the front line, and then there was a period of maybe 6 to 12 months, which when you would achieve your certificate of competence, that meant that your wings then were properly sewn on. So, I was pre-C of C, and we were coming back from Scotland somewhere, and we were down nearly home, near Lundy, and we got a call came in that a fishing vessel had sunk, and so we were scrambled to go and try and conduct a rescue. And again, my flight commander was brilliant. He didn't say, I'm going on this, you stay there, Junior Joe. Off I jolly well went. And we got airborne. A SAR aircraft was on its way from Coldrose. There was a SAR aircraft out from Broady, and we'd probably been on task maybe 45 minutes, and then the Broady cab ditched. Which was completely surreal. And in fact, the RAF search and rescue were all yellow. The Navy's have always been red and grey. Yeah. And I had misheard or been misbriefed the SAR aircraft that was on task. So I thought it was a rescue call sign from Coldrose. So I was expecting a red and grey one. When the message came in over the radio that they had got a double indication and they were ditching, my immediate actions, mark the plot, get the aircraft going in the right direction. And it was pretty rough, as I recall. And literally, as we arrived on scene, I looked out of the window to the side of the observer, and I could see this yellow helicopter. And I was thinking, blimey, where did the yellow one come from? I don't understand. And then the yellow one ditched, and I was thinking, bloody hell, the Sea King's falling out the sky all over the place. Until, of course, I then MB'd. It never was a red and grey one, it was a yellow one. So, so exciting time. So we're always ready for that. So, and we will always brief SAR even when we do this crew constitution. Even these days it will be, who's the P1, who's the P2, observer, air crewman, right, in the event of a SAR, then you're going to be the winch operator, you'll go down on the wire. So that's a standard brief that we do all the time.
And is that interchangeable? I mean, could it be you that goes down on the...
Yeah, 9 times out of 10, the crewman probably, back in the day, did more operations with a winch. It would become, particularly if they were old and bold crewmen, they would probably say, I hear what you're saying, sir, but you're going down on the wire. Sometimes, though, if you were doing something like a long ranger, for example, then the last thing perhaps that you wanted to do was you didn't want to, not that you wanted to lose anyone, but you didn't want your observer to get a dunking and then suddenly you go, right, we've now got 220 miles to go back and what's the fuel, etc., etc., etc. So it was forever flexible.
So what other ships did you serve with then?
So my first tour I was on Cumberland, as I say. Then from there I went to 810 Squadron, which is operational flying training, and I was just a staff observer there while I was waiting to go to a carrier. Throughout my career, Sea King and Merlin, I've embarked on Royal Fleet Auxiliaries 25 times, I think, so for various deployments. So, it would have been a tanker somewhere or other. I then went out to 820 when they were in the Adriatic, and I embarked in Art Royal. So I was Art Royal, Illustrious, again, RFAs, and that is probably... And very briefly, I think for about 3 days, we did embark on board HMS Norfolk, which is a Type 23, which when that frigate came into service, it was designed to operate with a Merlin, but we went on board with a Sea King, and we were the one and only Sea King flight ever to be on a Type 23. And we were on there, I think, for 3 days was all we lasted before the powers that be decided that it was too dangerous for a Sea King to be on the back of a Type 23, so we came off.
Really? So what would you characterise as the differences, besides the bar, the differences between operating on the RFAs, operating on a frigate and operating on a carrier?
When you're on a smaller ship, it really feels like a warship, because I guess there's a smaller number of people. You're all very focused on whatever task you've got to do. I absolutely loved it. And whilst, there'll be many aviators that probably have a special place in their heart for their first tour. I remember at the end, particularly at the end of the West Indies, however many people there were in Cumberland, 250, I'm not sure, something like that. I knew them all. And probably 50% of those, I probably knew what their favourite drink was. And then I can remember by the time I then went to Art Royal, which was in the Adriatic, doing, the support to Bosnia, obviously they had an augmented air group on board. I can remember I went into the wardroom the first night and there seemed to be as many people in the wardroom in Art Royal than there were in the whole of Cumberland. So I think the warship element, there is a real close, tight-knit world and you get to know everybody. The carrier is a bit more cliquey because the main area for us to live in was in the wardroom, and the mess was always designed in sort of gulches, so they'd be seated areas where you could probably seat groups of 10 or 15 or something like that. So, and at the time there were probably nigh on 40 officers, pilots, observers and air engineers on a squadron. So that's where the pingers sit, that's where the bag freaks sit. Well, where are the jet guys? Well, you'll know when they arrive because they'll tell you. So I guess it became a bit, that the carrier was a bit more cliquey, but it was a great place to be because there was just stuff happening the whole time. And just in that sheer bulk of people, to be on a carrier when there's a day off and they do a steel deck barbecue, or there's people on board because you've got 1,000 people on board. There's people who play musical instruments, they formed a band, they do this, they do that. It's a great place to be. And the Fleet Auxiliary is just slightly different because, again, back then when I did the bulk of my time on them, they were less war-y focused probably. So it was a nice way to deploy, because when you're on a warship, for example, you shared, the chances are you would have a 2-berth cabin. So they would be bunk beds, which were, a bit wider than the library shelf. They might be one above each other, or classically when we were in Cumberland, me and my Oppo, we're on either side. And And so there was a small space between you, and you basically climbed up into your bed. So underneath there was your chest of drawers, there was a pull down bit which was your desk, so you could do your divisional work, look after your people, all that, write letters home, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So there wasn't a lot of room. When you're in an RFA, they were huge in comparison. RFA Ulna, which was all wood panelled in the cabins, and it was, it was all a bit surreal, really. As wow, I'm on a. It's grey on the outside, but you wouldn't have thought that from the inside,
Yeah.
kind of.
Yeah. Did you spend time on any of the amphibious RFAs?
No, because they don't have hangars. So Bulwark and Albion, only fleeting visits to both of them, but never embarked because there's no hangar.
Is that the same on the Bay class? Did they not have hangar space?
I don't think I've never embarked in a bay.
Yeah. And my only experience of being on any of these kind of ships, I spent 24 hours on the Nimitz once out in the Gulf doing some liaison work, and it didn't matter what time of day or night it was. If I stood still on that ship, I was in somebody's way. What other ops did you do then after your first stint was that Caribbean stint? Where else did you get to?
So then I went out to the Adriatic in support of the Bosnian ops. So yeah, we did fly ashore, but we only went, we would take people to and from Split, so right on the coast. So we never did any flights over land. We didn't have a defensive aid suite in our Sea Kings. The Junglies did. We didn't have anything. Although we did low level flying, we didn't do low level tactical flying. We never had goggles or anything like that. So we would have been meat on the street, I think, if we'd flown over land.
When you say no defensive aid suite, you had passive, didn't you? But not. You said you didn't have active. You didn't have countermeasures. You had a passive system for detection.
Well, not directly. We had a passive electronic support measures system. So the orange crop, it would pick up ships' threat radar as opposed to, if someone fired a manpad at you, you wouldn't have
Yeah.
it would either be a bang or blimey, what's that? As it went past.
Yeah.
So I did that then, and I did that in Arc and in Illustrious. Then 97 we were sent to Sierra Leone. So we had just finished the last flight of operational flying training. By this point I was an instructor, and we were told to land on because the ship was doing a 180, and we were only a day away from Cornwall, thinking, what's going on? And then they said, you're going to Sierra Leone. So we're stopping in Gibraltar to pick up some weapons, pick up some people, and then we're going south. Oh, okay. But that was great. That was really exciting for the students to see how quickly we went from a training focus to an operational focus. It was really exciting. I was ops on the flight at the time, so I was really busy. And as it was a bit of a letdown when we got turned round. The op was over, and then I think a year or two, or maybe more afterwards, it flared up again, and then there was more of an effort, and the Brits were more involved this time. But it was lovely to have that focus. I always remember talking to my father. So when my father did his flying training in Canada during the war, and by the time he came back to Europe, he deployed for the first time to Austria and Italy, but it was after VE Day.
Right.
And so he always said that, they would have a big discussion amongst themselves, as there were some that were, I'm really disappointed that it's all over, because I wanted to see if all that training to have a go at the Hun, as it were, I suppose. There are others that were, thank God for that, because, I didn't want to put it to the test because in case it went the wrong way.
Because you just don't know, do you? Yeah.
No, exactly. And all you can do is train for it. As I said, just like you said about those, sorties. 1 minute you're a day away from Cornwall, heading north, and then the next within half an hour, you're back on deck heading south. Well, wow, what's going on?
Yeah.
That's the great thing about flying at sea, I think, is that prospect of, well, will the ship be where it said it was going to be when we finish? And of course, if it's rough, landing on a frigate, 17 feet, I think a Type 23 is 15 feet now, and it's jumping about a bit. You're sitting in the back thinking, make sure you get this right, Popeye, please. Thank you. I joined the Navy to fly at sea. There's a bit of me, my last job, I would have loved to have been on one of the new carriers, because I was thinking, well, that's what I joined the Navy to do, was fly at sea. And it never bothered me going away, doing this, that and the other. Obviously, it was hard yards for my wife at home, and of course, hard yards for me being separated from the family. But
yeah,
that was my job, and I loved every minute of it. I'd go do it again if I could.
Yeah, yeah, of course. And you did what, about 9 years on the Sea King?
Yeah, Sea King. I started training on the Sea King in '91 or back end of 1990, and I said goodbye to Sea King at the end of December '99. Then I went to Australia.
Yeah, so you went off to Australia, did a few years out there with the Royal Australian Navy flying the Seahawk.
Yeah, 3 years. Yeah, with them.
How did that compare?
The Seahawk then was like a space age machine compared to the Sea King.
Yeah.
So although, and the difference was the observer, or TACO, tactical coordinator they called them, which is probably a much better name than observer. You flew in the front left-hand seat. So it was great, you could look out the window for doing surface search and stuff. Particularly, and then you had a radar which was under the chin, which you controlled with your right hand doing stuff, so you could control your tactical display and then identify stuff out the window. You had a pilot in the right hand seat. You were taught to fly, so yeah, the TACOs had to be able to land the aircraft ashore by day or night in case the pilot was incapacitated, or they had to be able to ditch it alongside the ship, because it was always deemed probably there would be fewer casualties if you ditched alongside than if you tried to land it on the ship, and could potentially take out the ship. Which with my flying skills I could quite see as a possibility. I had a great time. I did. It was about a year's worth of conversion for me, by which time I was a warfare instructor. So it was a warfare instructors exchange. I was already in the Far East, so I went to sea for 3 months, but did the Philippines, Hong Kong, Korea, and a couple of other places. I did a month or so long deployment, which was peacekeeping in the Solomons, which was interesting. They were all handing in their arms and bits and pieces, and we flew around with some troops just to make sure that everything was all going according to plan. But that was great, and it was amazing flying around the Solomon Islands, because you were at Guadalcanal, you were, wherever it is, Henderson Field, all these places where the big red one, and as I'm a massive military historian, it was just quite incredible, really, what you could see. Pacific. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And then I came back from there and then went Merlin.
So you'd seen the last of the Sea King at that point. You came back.
Yeah.
To the Merlin.
In fact, I think a couple of times, probably doing exercises, I would have been picked up by a Sea King and taken somewhere, and then by that stage I was used to either the Seahawk or the Merlin, and we'd just sit in the back thinking, blimey, don't go very fast, does it? Yeah, it's pretty slow. Looking at that ground speed and drift indicator thinking, what, we're flying into a headwind, we're doing 80 knots, come on. So no, that was the end of my Sea King time.
And then onto the Merlin.
Merlin Mark 1, yeah, was for me, and I flew on I did a conversion again as soon as I came back from Australia. I was on the trials unit as the senior observer, second in command. Then I went to 814, which was a carrier squadron. So we took whatever it was, 6 aircraft to sea. Went back to the carrier for the first time with Merlin, which was great. And then the CO was unwell at one point, so I took command for 6 weeks, I think, and then I had a shore job after that. Then I was selected for command, and I went to 820, which I'd served on twice in my Sea King days. I was extremely fortunate and honoured to go back there as the boss, and I was there for a long time, 3 years. In fact, I'm the longest serving Fleet Air Arm CO in history, I think.
Any hair-raising stories from your time on the Sea King to share?
Well, I guess the obvious one is I'm a goldfish, which is always an interesting lift conversation. So the Goldfish Club was formed in 1942. A chap who was the chief draftsman for the whatever aircrew survival ministry or something or other. He worked in a raft factory in Streatham in London, and he noticed that often RAF crews would come in and thank the ladies, as it was the vast majority were ladies working in the factories because the blokes had gone off to war, but thank them and say, your raft kept me alive, da 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 da, thank you very much indeed. Might be a good idea if there was a hat in there, there were gloves like wicketkeepers' gloves that we could use as paddles, whatever. But at the time, there was a real quick turnaround because they were so short of aircrew. And this guy, the draftsman, Robbie Robertson, he thought, wow, it's pretty traumatic what they've gone through. And he wasn't an aviator. No one had invented the phrase PTSD then. Yeah. And he thought, wouldn't it be a good idea if they could talk to each other? So he came up with this idea of, hey, if we have this, let's call it the Goldfish Club. Gold for the value of life, fish obviously because of the sea. It was approved by the Air Ministry and it started in November 42, and by the end of the war they capped membership at 10,000. Every person that joined, he got a hand addressed and signed letter from Robbie Robertson, which I think I worked it out in that period, it was 10 letters a day he was signing, I think every day. They had a fantastic membership card which I would pass on to listeners. Just Google the Goldfish Club, and I think that there's probably on the website there's probably a picture of the original membership card. But I didn't even know they could do it then. He laminated them. I didn't know you could laminate, but it was laminated in case you ditched again, which I always thought was a great thing to do. So September '98, we were going to embark on a Dutch ship, the Poolster, I think it was. So we were flying across to Holland to go and have a pre-ops meeting. As we flew across the channel, we heard a mayday call go out, and a Jaguar out of Coltishall had got into difficulties. Pilot had banged out, jet had gone in. All military aircraft carry a saltwater activated beacon, and with the sonar, when I mentioned with the big electronic microphone, which can ping, it can also listen. So by basically jumping in 2 or 3 positions, you can get a cross fix. Right. So although they had a 2 decimal place GPS fix on where the Jag went in, we were retasked from Decoy, I think we were in, to go find it. My mum and dad had run pubs, and I had a fixation for Guinness, but I particularly loved their advertising material. But of course, because of the troubles, we could never go to Ireland, but the Poolster was going to Dublin. I was like, oh, all my prayers have been answered. I'm going to go on a massive Guinness fest in Dublin. It'll be brilliant. Anyway, so we got to Coltishall. It's a Friday afternoon. We didn't launch till about 6 o'clock. It was early September, but, blue sky, looked lovely. The Top Gear team was supposed to be there, and they were doing a race of whatever car it was along a runway against the Jag. Then the Jag was going to burn around and go, and it was Battle of Britain weekend. So they were having a reception in the officers' mess, and I remember saying to the aircraft commander, we should always carry an ensign, because when we come back from this sortie and the Jag has burnt past and everyone's seen it and hurrahed, then we would stream the ensign, fly past at 40 knots, and then obviously go in and trash the mess. That as standard routine.
As you would, yeah.
And so we went out, and we had a position to start with. Did our dips, literally just done the 3rd dip when the aircraft caught fire. And so where the observer's console is, over on the left-hand side, by the window, above the radar, the big round bit, and the controls at the top, there's a little gap about 2 inches or so, just enough for you to be able to flick these at the boys in the front and vice versa in some irate moment of the sortie. Anyway, flames started coming down through this gap, and I remember thinking, that is a bloody neat trick. How have they done that? And then the next minute, the whole back of the aircraft was ablaze. And of course, then it was it's nothing to do with them. It's no trick. This is for real. And I looked over at the luckily, the aircraft was in the hover, so it was still at 40 feet, which was really, really fortunate, as things turn out. And I looked across at the crewman, and the crewman was shouting and screaming. And fortunately, we were all wearing goon bags, immersion suits. And that had been at the assistance of the aircraft commander, because the JAG guy had been in the water for 45 minutes and the water temperature was 17 degrees. And although he'd been in a raft, he was just going into hypothermia.
And this was this in the wash somewhere?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it was in the wash. Yeah. And so when he said, "Oh, we're going to wear goon bags," I remember thinking, it's a lovely day. There's a party in the mess. What are you talking about? But anyway, so we did, which was really fortunate. So anyway, fires blazing. I looked across at the air crewman, and he was like, again, for older listeners out there, the bloke on the front cover of Pink Floyd's "Wish You Were Here." That's exactly what he looked like, covered in flames, shouting his head off. And I was thinking, this is not good. And I got up out of my seat and then thought, we're on fire. This is bad news. It's terminal now, because it was proper blaze. Yeah. I need to put the fire out. There was a fire extinguisher in the Sea King, but that was down by the doctor's seat, which is far back left. And you'll probably notice in yours, or whether or not the fire extinguisher's probably been removed, but there's probably still a clip.
Yeah.
That's the doctor's seat, was the one at the back, because when you were on a SAR, that's where the doctor would sit. Oh, well, I was never going to get to that and come back in time. So I thought the only way I could put the flames out was to beat the flames out with my hands. So again, for your watchers and listeners, don't try this at home, because all I did was set fire to both my hands. And, everything time slices. And when we had the emergency and it started to catch fire, in the Sea King, the drill was always put your seat down and back. And I always used to forget doing that, but I did it. And I remember thinking, oh, that was really good. I must tell the drills chief when I get back that I did the right thing. And likewise, when both my hands were on fire, I was waving my hands around in front of my face. And all I could think about was, and as I told you, my dad was a Spitfire pilot. So I've probably seen the Battle of Britain, I don't know, 200 times, but I was Christopher Plummer. At that moment, I knew that was the image in my head as to where I was. And the pilots could hear us shouting and screaming down the back. So they made the conscious decision to put the aircraft on the water, and then made the decision to obviously shut the aircraft down, by which point, when they went for the speed select levers up here, the fireball had come all the way forward to that point when they cut the speed selects. So which they thought, oh, the aircraft's still on fire. So then they made the conscious decision to put the fire out to turn the aircraft over. So at the time of ditching, and whether you've ever done the Dunker or, again, any other people that have had the pleasure of that wonderful piece of kit, they say, breath hatch harness out, wait till all violent motion has ceased before you unstrap. So I was unstrapped on the floor on fire when we hit the water, and then that's where we rolled from. So I saw the cabin fill up with water, and then I could see, wacky angles as it was obviously rolling over. Yeah. I opened my eyes when I was underwater. The air crewman went out of the cargo door window, and my eyes must have just been, I was fortunate. I didn't get washed anywhere. I wasn't consciously holding on to anything. My eyes must have just been like some magical Star Wars tractor beam focused on the window. And I went to go through the window after him. I got halfway through the window, and then I got stuck. And I reached a really weird sense of calm, and I knew I was going to die. And I didn't panic at all. I just felt really comfortable. It's really weird and difficult to explain. And I felt like, well, I must have been breathing water at that point. And one thing I would have loved, I wished back then we had something like a GoPro that someone could say, do you know what, we've done all that now, and it actually lasted 3.5 seconds. Or someone said, do you know what, it was 2.5 minutes. It's really difficult to tell. But through all the years, and the value of doing drills, whenever we used to do pool drills, which was every 6 months, when you jump, they'd always give you your jacket, put your seat pack on, which would have your life raft and everything else.
Yeah.
But it didn't have all the kit in it, so it would be buoyant. So they'd always give you a hard hat. And that was because as soon as you jumped in the water, the seat pack would fly up behind you and smack you on the back of the head. And of course, I then realised that going through the window, well, that's what snagged, it's my seat pack. So I just jiggled the seat pack. I didn't even have to release it. It came loose, and then I kicked for the surface, came up, and then there were 3 of us, and we were a crew of 4. And I remember there was this frantic shouting for the 4th crew member, the flying pilot, to appear. And then he appeared, and it was just the best feeling in the world because, we were all alive. We were fine. Well, within reason, we were fine. So then I went across to the crewman, because when I'd seen the crewman, he'd been in flames and screaming. And he, then he was an old man. He was in his 40s. And I remember thinking, well, he was in a really bad way, etc., etc. He'll be going into shock, everything else. So I swam over to him. And then, of course, we headed to where the pilots were. Meanwhile, pilots were in their rafts, happy as Larry, waiting for us to join them as usual. And I knew that my hands had been burnt. I managed to get into my raft, and we all tied up together. And it was only when they were saying, mate, are you all right? I hadn't realised, well, all this side of my face had been burnt entirely. And we were in the water for about 40 minutes or so. I was convinced I had no hands, but I was really fortunate in that in the rotary world we were issued winching gloves, which had a second layer around the palm and up parts of the finger, which it was thicker leather. So I was really fortunate because for whatever reason I wore those that day. So although my hands were burnt, badly burnt, it wasn't, all over the hand. Everywhere where there was a double thickness or treble thickness of leather, my hands didn't burn at all. It was pure heat transfer through the single. So I was very lucky. Fishing boat saw us and offered to take us aboard, but that had about a 6-foot freeboard and then a whole load of structure over the top. And I said, how on earth am I going to get in there? No hands. Being like a Monty Python sketch. It's merely a scratch. I'll bite my way up. And then I said, when a helicopter pitches up, we'll have to jump back in the sea anyway. So anyway, after about 45 minutes or so, a SAR cab came from Bulmer, I think, picked us up, took us to the field, by a beach somewhere near Norwich. And there were 2 ambulances there, then took us to Norwich Hospital. And as they say, the rest is history. So I became a goldfish, and I'm now the chairman of the worldwide club. So there's a bit of me, Go on.
What was the fire?
So the engine, the sonar is powered, the up and downy bits, by hydraulics. The hydraulics is under pressure. I'm not sure what it is, 3,000 psi or something. So it's in an armoured pipe, so a braided armoured pipe. That had been misrouted, and basically the way that they had routed the pipe, it went against an electrical terminal block, which is capped on wiring. So I guess a bit like, again, for those, a bit like Bakelite, as opposed to what we might be used to now. That caused arcing on the terminal block, which then burnt a hole through the armoured pipe. And it was only 0.5 mil, but obviously 3,000 psi coming out through that hole then made like an aerosol and a match. And of course you couldn't stop it. The only way to stop it was for it to burn out, which is what it did.
Yeah, and to go back to your comments about the dunker, whenever you do the dunker, you start from what would be an expected position, don't you? You're strapped in,
Yeah,
so you found yourself in a completely unusual position when the aircraft went into ditching, didn't you?
yeah, 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 absolutely. Yeah, I mean, they do one in the Dunker, and certainly now, where that you just get in it as quick as you can, and then literally they ditch it straight away. But I'd done the Dunker literally about a month before I ditched. The next time I did it, I went to Australia, and it was run by civvies there, and I was really naturally really nervous. And I said, "Right, guys, I just got to tell you, the last time I did this, it was for real. So I'm not quite sure what will happen. You know, I might completely freak out." And as you can imagine, in true Australian fashion, they just said, "Mate, you should be effing teaching this." And I did the Dunker. It was fine. It was no problem at all. You know, I've only ever had one nightmare ever since the ditching. But subsequently, obviously, I got through the Dunker. That was no problem. And every time I've come back in while I was still flying and did it, the team in the Dunker are absolutely brilliant. I never had
Yeah,
any troubles at all. They're really good.
yeah, amazing.
So that's my
And
exciting seeking story.
yeah, crikey. So you don't fly now, do you? But you're still involved with the Merlin world.
Yeah, so I left the Navy about 6 years ago, and I've done various bits and pieces. But the last year, I've gone back to being an instructor in the Merlin simulator. So last year I had to do a simulator Merlin Mark II conversion, so the old dogs new tricks kind of gag.
Yeah,
And so yeah, I'm doing that now, which is great. So I'm really enjoying it. It's a great way of staying in touch with the young generation, and I think for many of them, you know, some of those experiences, very hard won in places, they have their place for being able to teach the people stuff that, you know, there's a good
yeah,
chance they will never see, or there'll be some moment when they go, "I can remember Jason telling me about this once."
yeah, yeah, definitely. I did an exchange tour on the Strike Eagle, and a lot of the sim instructors there were guys who'd flown like F4s in Vietnam
Wow.
and this sort of thing, and one who'd flown Bales, Sky Raiders. Yeah, they had some stories to tell.
Yeah.
Yeah, crikey. So, is there anything that you're involved in now that you want our viewers to know about?
Well, I guess I'm extremely passionate about all levels of aviation and aviation heritage. Fleet Air Arm, naturally, as you would expect. But
Mm,
again, through the Goldfish Club, so I write the newsletter. I started off writing the newsletter for the Goldfish Club, which I've done for about 10 years or so now. But I'm their archivist. So when I said the membership was limited at the end of the war to 10,000, once the war finished, someone must have thought people will only be interested in wartime. So, you know, one of the biggest tragedies in my life is someone decided to destroy all the records. Every now and again, I dream that someone will pitch up with a tea chest and there'll be 10,000 letters in there, but sadly, not as yet. So I'm the self-appointed archivist. So it's really important to me because I think the Goldfish Club is the last surviving World War II club that still
mm,
functions, as in it has a constitution, has a committee. We have an annual reunion. You know, this year will be our 84th. So it's really important to me. And it's lovely. I went on the Antiques Roadshow because I was conscious of people turning up with dad or granddad's medals and his logbook. And then they would go, "Oh, and this entry here, ditch, means he's a member of the Goldfish Club." But they never said anything about the Goldfish Club. So I went on one from the Eden Project and took some of the archive. So that was great because normally our interest might be maybe two a month, I reckon, something like that, of people that say, "I think my uncle may have been a member. Can you tell me anything?" I think within 20 minutes we'd had 15 inquiries of when it went on air the first time.
crikey.
And I love that because
Yeah,
people come to you and they say, "I think my uncle did this, that, and the other." That all the stories intermesh, and sometimes there can be links, or someone says, I think my uncle did this, and you go, well, actually, do you know what, I've checked the records and he ditched 3 times or whatever, and I'm writing this with tears in my eyes, I can't believe that, this happened, or my dogs are really pissed off because I just received your email while I was taking them for a walk, and I've had to turn round now because I've got to ring my brother and sister immediately to tell them about what Dad did, or something like that. And so I love all that. It really has a sense of purpose and of connection for people. So
if people want to know more about that, is there a website they should go?
yeah, there's a website. So imaginatively, www, the Goldfish Club, and they'll find it. There's stories on there. There are various bits and pieces. I've had people in the past who have ditched, who then never joined because they were backseat crew. They were told it was pilots. I always say to them, it would be lovely if Sully Sullenberger joined from Miracle on the Hudson, but even from early days, we've reached out to him. But of course, there's probably 30 layers of people before you ever get to Sully.
Yeah.
Ditching's ditching. It's probably terrifying, although some of them are relatively straightforward, of course, but it's pretty terrifying wherever you end up being. It's that action and the very act of being able to have someone who's done something similar to you, as that, is across the world in so many walks of life with everything, being someone who has an understanding of what you've gone through, just as we'll be able to talk about flying training. And although, vastly different, actually the theory is the same. And that bit of, the fear of being chopped and this and that. And God, I learnt about flying from that. And all, we could spin bits to each other, stories for the uninitiated, for ages. And so to be able to do that with people is fantastic. And at our reunion last year, for example, there were about 30 goldfish that were there with other halves and friends. Someone beautifully comes each year who's a young lad. He was doing a cargo flight and he was actually carrying a load of tropical fish, and the load shifted, and so he stalled and ended up in the water. Again, that humour in me of becoming a goldfish whilst carrying a load of goldfish, I think is pretty awesome. Equally, you can have people, we were really fortunate in our crew, and I will never forget ever that sense of what it was like to see the complete crew on the surface. To be in a position where they weren't all there, I can't imagine what that would be like. So, I can just count myself as being incredibly fortunate to have survived. As I say, the Goldfish Club's really important to me, and long may it continue in the future.
Jace, that's been brilliant. An hour and a half has absolutely flown past. I'm sure our viewers will find this thoroughly entertaining. So thanks very much for your time.
No, my absolute pleasure. And again, if anyone contacts you because they want to ask me something, or they know me, or whatever the case may be, then I'm very happy for you to pass on my details.
Okay, brilliant. Right, thanks very much.
Right, my pleasure. Thank you.